Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast Too Much Disinformation, the pod that uncovers the good, the bad, and the fake of the online world. I'm your host, Rafi Mendelsohn, and on today's pod, we're going to be talking cyber insurance in the age of disinformation. And talking us through this topic is Jason Rebholz. Jason is the CISO at Corvus Insurance, an insurance company that provides insurance solutions, but you may recognize him as the face of Teach Me Cyber, a YouTube channel where Jason helpfully breaks down cybersecurity ideas and trends in easy to understand and bite-sized videos. His video about DDoS attacks specifically is my personal favorite. Might not be yours. You might prefer one of the other over 50 videos that he's created. He also updates his audience with daily knowledge posts on LinkedIn, and I personally enjoy that as well. At high school, Jason was interested in speed, Rubik's Cube, and the debate club, and I think those two skills really show themselves in his channels as he communicates effectively about technical cyber topics. So without further ado, let's start the show. Hey Jason, how you doing?
Good. How you doing today?
Very good, thank you. Really good. Really looking forward to this topic because I think I'm going to be learning a lot today, and it's something that I don't think many people give much thought behind, but is actually incredibly important and incredibly challenging as well. So we're going to be talking about cyber insurance in the age of disinformation. But before we get to that topic, I do have to ask you, what was your first ever social media platform?
It depends on how you're going to define this. I would say it's either going to be AOL Instant Messenger in the first age of the profiles and away messages, but I think the first official one was probably MySpace before it became the music platform that it still is today, which is still crazy to think about.
Nice, nice. There's something when people say the word AOL Messenger, I still hear the dial-up noise in the back of my head. I still hear that horrible noise that is just so synonymous with, okay, I'm going to go into the internet now and go into AOL Messenger.
Yeah, it's definitely a way that you can date yourself on when you started using the internet.
Fantastic, fantastic. Great. So we're going to be covering a really, really interesting topic. And we're going to be talking about kind of cyber insurance, how companies, I presume of all sizes, really protect themselves from cyber attacks. But of course, the cyber attacks themselves have changed over the years and have become more complex or become more difficult, or there are new ones all the time. So I think maybe a good place to start is just hearing from you, what are those threats that you are seeing coming from the online space that are being aimed at companies?
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is that there are endless amounts of threats that are out there, and it really can start to get boiled down into a few different categories. And I have a very biased view, just how I grew up in the industry, where I was doing investigations into nation state threats. These are countries that are hacking into other governments, on also private organizations. And then I also was riding the ransomware wave. I can remember back in 2016 when there was a shift from single system encryptions to these enterprise-wide encryptions. And so all of these things really go hand in hand together. But the way that I think about it is really in terms of the amount of velocity that we're seeing behind certain types of attacks. So, I look at it as ransomware is one of the most prolific things that is happening right now. But you also have these other types of attacks where it's more socially engineering driven. We call them business email compromises in the insurance world. But those are when somebody's sending a phishing email to other users to try to get them to take action. And then you also have those more sophisticated, not to say that these other ones aren't sophisticated, but there's a whole nother league of attacks that happen that are more just nation state driven, whether it's espionage, whether it's just trying to get a competitive advantage, or in some cases, less nation state, more organized crime, where you're just having very sophisticated hacks that are just trying to get something for financial gain. So it really kind of runs the gambit, but that's how I would really lump down the highest velocity attacks that we're seeing today.
Fascinating, fascinating, and it's so interesting that you mentioned nation states. And I once heard a CISO of a very large financial company say to me that large global multinationals have to think like countries. And so when you talk about also nation states and the threats that they pose as well, I don't know if there's kind of any more information or if you're able to expand on that specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense. And I feel like that is something that only somebody who has lived through it is going to say, right? Because that is a comment just from sheer experience. Because, normal people aren't just going to think like that. But it's very, very true. And the reason for that is uh, governments don't just hack other governments, right? And like that's something that, Mandiant really unearthed with their APT1 report years and years ago, where they saw that China had dedicated hacking groups that would hack into private organizations and government agencies. And so the reason why this is important is because when you reach a certain size of a company or even just an industry, because there's certainly startups that are getting attacked as well, when you reach that specific size, you are now on the radar of these nation state threats. And with that comes a level of sophistication that a lot of organizations don't have to deal with, right? And so what was always interesting to me, I'll just single out China here in particular, because it was amazing to see when they created their 5-year plan for their country, they had specific industries that they would want to go after. And when you look at that, and when that report is released, and then you look at the private organizations that were getting hit by China, it was a one-to-one mapping, right? And so for these organizations, they don't have a choice but to really think like a government here, because they have to be thinking about, it's not just a ransomware event that we have to worry about. It is a very dedicated and well-resourced adversary that is going to take their time and energy and focus on me exclusively. It's not the law of numbers here. It's not an opportunistic attack. It is a specific target on your organization. And it's not how a lot of people think about it. They think like cybersecurity or hacks are just like a happenstance thing. Oh, we didn't have some controls in place, or even if we did, it was just bad luck. No, in these situations, like, you're dealing with an adversary that's specifically targeting you.
Wow. And also, you're talking about circumstances that are outside of these companies' control. Yeah, there are global events happening around them. And all of a sudden, because of those activities, then all of a sudden they're in the glare, whether it's, foreign that is taking place and affected them, or, we've also seen, for example, protests that are taking place around election times, or if there's a kind of unhappiness against governments and regimes, then the protesters start to target specific businesses, either because they're Western businesses or because they're local businesses, and that's all of a sudden a target for them.
Exactly. I mean, just look at all the hacktivists that are out there now, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a good example of this, where you had these hacking groups that essentially just started taking up arms, and whether you were located in Russia or you're located in a Western country that was supporting Ukraine, or a Ukrainian business as well. A lot of these companies are just collateral damage in whether it's a kinetic war that's including cyber operations. Or even just a philosophical war. It's, if you're connected online and doing business, and somebody perceives that you're associated with somebody that they don't like, yeah, unfortunately, you're a potential target there.
Mm. And before we press record, when we were speaking just off air, you were also talking about some of the threats and hacks that are coming companies' ways, but from and are emerging from the social media space. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, this is something that I'm paying really close attention to, because it kind of scares me. And the reason for it is it's another shift in how we think about security. And so, if you look back to really over the last year, it started gaining popularity, but there's a lot of attacks that are targeting tech companies, crypto companies, things of that nature. And they're originating from social media. And that's going to be things like, you have these groups, these hacking groups that are creating fake LinkedIn profiles, and like going to the point where they'll actually put like real posts out, just like, something to fill the timeline, connecting with other people. So it's not just like your typical fake profile with no profile picture and like 0 followers. there's actually some legitimacy behind it. And even where, there's certain groups that are creating like fake GitHub profiles, and like, I've seen some where they're stealing the profile picture of a famous security researcher or whatever. And it's just like, it's adding more and more just substance behind it. But all of this is to get to the first part of an attack of trying to get access into a company. And so what's interesting here is that they're no longer trying to just go to the front door and, find a vulnerability. Like that definitely happens, but especially as you start having companies shift to cloud native, where they don't really have an on-premise infrastructure, everything is tied to the identity. Well, the weak part has and always will be the human. And so now they're targeting the personal accounts, the personal devices of these employees, and they're making this bet here, which is a safe bet to make, that if they can get access to this employee who, whether it's on their personal social media accounts or, even just a professional one like a LinkedIn, their defenses might be down a little bit and their guards down a little bit. And so if they can trick that user into installing software on their system or potentially giving up their credentials there, now the attackers have just expanded their ability to try to gain access into that company or the resources. But social media is this perfect platform for them to be able to just slide right into those DMs and be like, hey, like, do you want to help, troubleshoot this, certain code and give them access to this GitHub, have them pull that down, run it on their systems, and boom, now they've got malware that's running on their system. So it's just expanding the potential attack vectors into companies, and trying to even think about how you protect the social media profiles for your users, right? It's like, yeah, you can do social, you can do security awareness training and stuff like that, but it's a whole different battlefield that most companies aren't really in a good position to even start thinking about.
And why do you think that this is only something that we've seen over the last year that you mentioned?
So it's definitely happened in the past, right? Like I've seen instances in the past, like back when Skype was still a big thing, where more nation state kind of threats would try to use that as a way in. But I think now it's just this perfect kind of timing of a lot of different things, where most professionals are going to have a LinkedIn profile. Most people or most organizations are shifting over to cloud resources. And identity is becoming kind of that main thing. So for attackers, it's like they've reached this point where it's just like the perfect alignment of how companies are running their technology, how individuals are operating, and just like most people are going to have some sort of social media account. And so like when these things merge together, it's just a ripe opportunity for hackers, and it's working, right? And that's the big thing, is like it's a very low effort thing to even create a fake profile that looks semi-legitimate, and somebody's probably going to fall prey to that. And so it's just like all these things are mixing together to create a ripe opportunity for attackers to take advantage of it.
Wow. And I think we should really be paying attention, myself and anyone who's listening should really be paying attention to this, because you're uniquely qualified, both for the company you work in, the hat that you wear as a CISO, and the fact that you are super active on YouTube, LinkedIn, and pretty much all social media channels. So you're kind of hyper aware of this, and you're really kind of on the front line and seeing this. Do you think other CISOs are generally aware of this as well, or it's kind of reached their consciousness?
I think it's really going to depend on the CISO, how they kind of grew up in the industry, and then also like what's the type of role that they have today, right? Because there are so many different flavors of CISOs that are out there, and I think you have some flavors that it's more checklist, right? It's like they're potentially heavily regulated, and it's just their key concern is, are we meeting the regulations that we're required to? And they probably don't have as much time or just capacity to really kind of think through these emerging threats. I think if you're a CISO in a tech company, you're seeing what's happening, and this is probably going to be more front of mind for you. But it's just like anything, right? Like depending on how you think about security, which I think is largely rooted in how you grew up in the industry, and then what's your typical day to day like? Where are your questions coming from? And kind of where's the pressure sort of situation, like that's really going to dictate how well prepared you are for this, and whether you're even thinking about it in the first place.
Interesting. Okay, so let's presume you have a CISO, right? You have a CISO who is aware of this, who is engaged in this topic, and they work for a large company, and they are coming to you, and they are saying, as you've outlined very eloquently, right? There are risks, kind of traditional, not necessarily newer risks, and there are also these emerging risks or things that you've been seeing over the last year, and then they're coming to you and saying, okay, how do I insure myself against this? What's that process then?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is just first understanding what are the most likely risks for your company, right? And so this is just like your classic risk mapping exercise, and then trying to understand, do we have the right controls in place to try to prevent these things? And I am a huge proponent of defense in depth. I don't believe that security awareness training is the end all be all of everything. It plays its role, but if we're relying on that to just be the only defense against social engineering attacks or anything else, like you probably already lost that battle. And so it's looking at these layered defenses and seeing how resilient is my security program. If I can I operate if 2 out of X number of security controls fail, which they will. How deep into my system is an attacker going to be able to get? They're going to be able to get access to sensitive data. They're going to be able to accomplish whatever that objective might be. And how does that relate to my business and their function, right? If it's in the financial industry, is 3 security failures going to allow them to get access into the crown jewels that's storing all the sensitive information? Or it's this sort of thing that you really have to kind of go through to understand. And so that's the primary role for a CISO, is to really think through strategically about how am I building this program and putting it in a way that it's going to be resilient. And then you have this other component of planning for failure, because at some point you can have the world's best security, but somebody is probably going to find their way in. And I think that's really where the role of cyber insurance comes in. Is like, let's plan for a catastrophic failure. And catastrophic can mean a lot of different things here, right? If all your security controls fail, that's catastrophic, right? It doesn't need to be this mass event, like a WannaCry or something like that. But in these events where something is going to fail, you do have that financial backstop there with cyber insurance, and you have access to a lot of different resources as well that can really help you respond to these attacks, or hopefully even prevent them from happening in the first place.
Interesting. So you've mentioned 3 things there. You've spoken about kind of mapping out the potential risks based on who the company is, what industry they sit in, things that are specific to them. And then the second thing is it's a presumption or a mindset that some of those defense mechanisms are going to fail. The question is kind of how many, and planning based on that. And then the third thing is, it's almost, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's almost starting from the worst case scenario of what's going to happen. What's the worst thing that can happen? Let's map those things out and almost work backwards, right?
Yeah, I would say the only thing I would change with that is it's the worst case scenario that's applicable to you. And that's the key, because I tell people all the time, security is an endless game of survival. And so the best way that you're going to survive is focusing on the things that matter most to you. And so I see this a lot, where a lot of organizations are solving for the worst case scenario that doesn't apply to them. And so it's just like, hey, you're not going to get bonus points for going down that route, right? Like, if it's not applicable, it's a waste of time. And so you really have to start with understanding what matters to my business, right? And so, I'm not going to solve for an edge case that is not applicable to my environment, right? Let's say if I'm running a Mac only environment, I don't need to solve for a Windows environment, right? And maybe I've got 1 or 2 systems there, but that's a very distant thing, and you can address that with a few key controls. So it's really about understanding what is applicable to my environment and making sure that you're modeling out on those threats, and from the whole chain, right? It's like from social engineering to get in, whether it's these hackers that are creating fake social media profiles, how are you addressing that, all the way down to, oh, you know what? How are they going to get access into my database that's housing all of this PII, whatever in there, all the sensitive information?
Yeah. I also want to refer to something that you threw out there earlier about not just relying on kind of employee education as the one size fits all solution, and that makes complete sense. But what does that look like? Especially with so much evolution in all of these changes, new threats coming up all the time, and let's be honest, not all employees are kind of engaged in this topic or maybe take it as seriously as they should. And an organization is only as good as its kind of weakest link. So how do you deal with that employee education piece?
Yeah, so I think part of it is just understanding how your users are going to receive the information, right? I fully believe that a lot of the security awareness training is just broken. Like an hour worth of material is not the way to teach people in today's society. It just doesn't work, right? And so, how can you kind of break this down into smaller chunks? I don't know what the right answer is. If it's doing it more frequent, but with more with better quality content and just a better effective delivery mechanisms. There's a lot of research that's being done on phishing simulations, and are those effective? Maybe not. So it's one of those things where I would much rather teach people via real world scenarios. Again, going back to like, what are you most likely to experience as an employee of this company, and help them with that, right? To give you an example of this, when I joined my company, I was looking at the phishing simulations we were doing. And it's like, we started off where it was just sending out phishing simulations for like gift cards and things like that. Guess what? Like, any standard email filter is going to catch those things. So why are we training for that, right? Like, an Olympic athlete is not training, for a 10-minute mile, right? Like, they're training to try to get, that 4-minute, 3-minute mile, whatever it is, right? So like, why are we going to train with the lightest amount of things possible? And so I'm much more of a proponent of like, give the realistic scenario, train them on the things that they're really going to be seeing that are most likely to bypass the defenses, and then train afterwards, right? Like, I'm super transparent. Like, here was our click-through rate, right? Again, here's how you can submit a phishing report to security or a phishing email to security. This is the things to look out for, right? And it's that repetition that I think is most important, because like, guess what? Like, the bottom line is most employees don't care about security. And that's not to say like they're going to just go and to be negligent, right? It's just like, that's not top of mind for them in their day-to-day, and I wouldn't expect it to be. And so I want to be able to help them identify these things, but I also want to help them when that inevitable slip-up is going to happen, that it mitigates the damage behind it, so that when somebody does click on a link, it's not that big of a deal, because I've already put the bubble around them to try to contain that impact.
Although most employees are nowadays going to be on multiple social media accounts. So if we talk just on the social media space, people are living their lives on social media. I think the days of having kind of two separate phones or of having your emails connected to different devices, and people are also using social media for the same things, and so therefore that's a threat vector, right?
Absolutely, right? Because we shouldn't be living under this assumption that people aren't accessing their personal accounts on their work device, right? Like, that's just not the world we live in today. And again, like, this is just like being realistic about it. I don't care what your policy states. Like, people are still doing this because it's just like, it's what they do. And so like with a social media account, right? Like, I can lock down that system, but if I've been spending all of my time trying to defend against phishing emails, and then an attacker just creates a fake social media profile and messages an employee directly and gets them to click on a link, like, that's like, what are you doing, right? Like, so like this is the exact thing, is like, we have to understand these types of scenarios, because that might not be something that a lot of people have thought about before, right? And so what other security controls are you putting in place to try to help mitigate that, right? And there's a whole slew of things you can do there. But also, like, are your employees aware that these hackers are going to try to target them on social media? Like, I can almost guarantee you there's like no security training that's talking about this. They're going to go as far as saying like, don't accept requests from random strangers. Again, like, this is just not the world we live in. Like
Mm.
this is where like I get so triggered by this reality where like we paint this perfect picture of how the perfect employee is going to operate in the security landscape, and it's just not realistic, right? Like people are going to accept things. It's just
Yeah.
the way it happens. So let's plan for that inevitable failure. Help them try to make the best informed decisions, but we're humans. We're all going to mess up. So let's just give them a soft landing spot as well, for them personally, so that their their whole lives aren't going to get uprooted if somebody steals their identity, but also like protect the company and make sure that this like one slip up isn't going to cause a catastrophic failure of everything else in the organization.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key learnings that I've taken from the conversation so far is that you have to make the scenarios when you're planning, or planning for the worst, or imagining all those different scenarios, and also you're putting that into training and education itself, that those scenarios have to be realistic and they have to be born out of the real world and actual real people's behavior in the real world. And yeah, I think that's interesting.
Exactly. And like people, we're humans. We live off of stories, right? And so this is why like I love talking about case studies, because one, they actually happened, and two, there's a lot of valuable lessons from them. And so
Yeah.
when you can talk about attacks in the sense of a story from start to finish, and what happened, how it succeeded, why the defenses failed, that's going to latch better onto into people's minds versus here's a list of 25 things that you can do to detect a phishing email, right? Like if you get people to remember two things from that list, great. But if you can talk about how hackers are, creating a fake email alias that is mimicking, your company's domain, and they're crafting these messages based on a news release that just happened, right? Like this is stuff that actually happens in the real world. Now
Hmm.
somebody's going to be able to go in there and say, oh, you know what? Yeah, I should really just double check to see if my boss is emailing me about something that he normally doesn't email me about. I probably should just check that email to make sure it's actually coming from him and not, this one that's just mimicking what the name looks like.
Right. And I think that brings us really nicely to the next part of the conversation, which is, you've mapped out the risks, you've kind of imagined all the different scenarios, you're kind of planning for the worst, but in a realistic scenario, positioned in the real world of how people work in the real life. So you've done that, and then how do you work with them to prevent it? Are companies kind of sitting there, both CISOs and also the work that you do with those organizations? Are they sitting there saying, okay, well, we've mapped them out, now let's just wait for one of them to happen? What steps? And you've spoken at length, you've spoken really comprehensively about the kind of employee education. Apart from that, what other steps can they take to mitigate this risk before it's even happened, to prevent it from happening?
Yeah, this just comes down to running an effective security program, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these are mistakes that I've made as a CISO as well. Is like we think that a tool is going to solve all of our problems, and it's not, right? It's the day to day. How are you setting up those tools? How are you configuring them? And then how are you responding to them?
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that's the better thing is how do you build consistency into your security program so that when you do get an alert or something suspicious pops up because you're doing threat hunting, whatever it is, right,
Mm-hmm.
that you have the muscle there to do a proper investigation, to put the right blocks in place to contain it, and to make sure that you're following up the right way. That's something that you have to build muscle to do. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's like it's the boring parts of security that matter most. And that's why I think security is so hard, because we all think that buying a new tool is going to solve all of our problems, but it's not. It's how you incorporate this into the day-to-day security operations of your company and just the blocking and tackling. And that's where I think most organizations should be focusing on security. It's that. It's running an effective program and making sure that it's going to be there. And then it's just having the right backstops in place, like cyber insurance, to make sure that when something does happen, it doesn't become this company-ending event.
So I think this conversation has been fascinating, and I really think that's kind of opened up, taught a lot, but also opened up, I think, a lot of other areas that, with your permission, I think we would like to keep an eye on, and maybe have you on, at a later date to kind of give us an update about how those threats are emerging, because I think it's so interesting the insight that you have both as a CISO and working insurance, cyber insurance, and also your footprint online as well in social media. But I have to conclude on the same question I ask all of our guests that come on. If you could let us know one thing good, one thing bad, and one thing fake that you're seeing in the online space today.
So I think my response is actually going to be the same for each one of those. And it's the access to free and useful information. I think it's good because it's an equal playing field for anyone that wants to learn anything about anything. I think it's bad because judging the quality of that information is extremely difficult, especially when we have fake information that's starting to come out in droves. And the fake thing is exactly that, is what happens when what you think is real in terms of things that you're learning, and this could be news events, this could be actual knowledge itself. What happens when that's fake? Because that happens all the time. And so I think, like, for me, it's really about, it's a double-edged sword. It's great to have all the information, but take the time to make sure that you're actually vetting it and validating that it's coming from a legitimate source that's guiding you in the right direction.
Amazing. I think that's an excellent answer that caps off an excellent conversation. So thank you to all the listeners who have listened to the conversation so far, and for tuning in for another episode of Too Much Disinformation. And of course, thank you, Jason, for making the time. Really appreciate it. And to you and to all the listeners, have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for having me.